My Karen neighbor screamed, "I'm going to kill your cat!" I live in a quiet suburb where most people keep to themselves. My house has a large garden that I spent 3 years turning into a sanctuary for my cat, Jasper. Jasper is a senior rescue with 3 legs and a very nervous disposition. He spent most of his life in a hoarding situation, so he does not handle noise or sudden movements well. The garden is the only place he feels safe enough to sunbathe. 6 months ago, a family moved in next door with 2 boys, aged 8 and 10. Within 48 hours, they were in my garden. I found them poking at Jasper with a plastic rake while he was trapped under a lawn chair. I walked them home and spoke to their mother, Sarah. I explained that Jasper is old, disabled, and easily terrified. I told her the garden was off limits. She gave me a blank stare and said they were just being boys. The following Saturday, I heard a crash. I ran outside to find the boys had climbed my oak tree and were throwing heavy pine cones at Jasper's outdoor enclosure. Jasper was frantic, throwing himself against the mesh trying to get out. I told the boys to get down and go home immediately. Sarah came out onto her porch and yelled at me for raising my voice at her children. She told me if my cat was that fragile, I should keep him in a cage inside. I didn't want a war, but I needed to protect my pet. I sent a formal letter via courier stating that the boys were trespassing and that any further incidents would be documented. I also installed high-definition cameras that covered every inch of the fence line and the garden. The peace lasted for a month. Then, while I was at the grocery store, I got an alert on my phone. I opened the app and felt my blood run cold. Both boys were in my yard. The older one had a high-powered water gun, and the younger one had a bag of large rocks. They had Jasper cornered against the back of the shed. The older boy was blasting Jasper in the face with a stream of water, while the younger one threw rocks at him. Jasper was screaming, a sound I had never heard a cat make before. He tried to scramble up the shed, but because of his missing leg, he kept falling back down into the line of fire. Finally, cornered and desperate, Jasper did the only thing he could. He lunged at the older boy's leg, sank his teeth in, and scrambled over the fence into the neighbor's yard to hide. I raced home. By the time I pulled into the driveway, Sarah was standing in my front yard with a kitchen knife in her hand. She was screaming that my beast had mauled her son and that she was going to kill that cat herself. Her son was sitting on their porch with a bloody scratch on his calf, wailing like he had lost a limb. I didn't say a word to her. I walked into my house, locked the door, and called the police. While I waited for them to arrive, Sarah's husband started banging on my siding, yelling that they were going to sue me for every penny I had and make sure Jasper was euthanized by the end of the day. When the police arrived, Sarah put on a performance. She cried about her poor, innocent children playing in their own yard when my vicious cat jumped the fence and attacked them for no reason. She demanded that the officers go inside my house and seize the animal. I stepped onto my porch and handed the lead officer my tablet. I played the footage from 10 minutes earlier. The video showed the boys climbing the fence with their weapons. It showed the systematic 3-minute torture of a cornered, disabled animal. It showed the older boy laughing as he hit Jasper in the eye with a rock. Most importantly, it showed that the bite happened on my property and that Jasper only attacked as a last resort to escape his tormentors. The officer's face went hard. He turned to Sarah and told her to stop talking. He explained that her children were not only trespassing but were engaged in felony animal cruelty. He told her that if she or her husband stepped foot on my grass again, they would be leaving in handcuffs. The bite was minor and didn't even require stitches, but the legal fallout for them was not. Because I had the video evidence and the previous letter of warning, the police filed a report for child neglect and animal abuse. Child Protective Services opened a case because the footage showed the parents were home and ignoring the boys' behavior for nearly 20 minutes. I haven't seen the boys in my yard since. Sarah and her husband won't even look at me when they pull out of their driveway. Jasper still spends his afternoons in the sun, but now he does it behind a new 8-foot privacy fence with a locked gate. I still watch the cameras every single day. For a few weeks, the silence from next door was heavy. It wasn't the good kind of silence you want in a suburb. It was the kind of quiet that feels like a coiled spring. I'd see Sarah through my window, standing in her kitchen, staring at my house while she washed dishes. She didn't have that frantic, screaming energy anymore. It was replaced by something colder. I'd be out at 7 a.m. getting the mail, and she'd be sitting in her car in the driveway, just idling the engine, watching me. Jasper was a mess. Even with the new privacy fence, he wouldn't go more than 2 feet from the back door. If a bird landed too hard on a branch, he'd bolt under the sofa and stay there for 4 hours. He stopped eating his wet food. I had to sit on the floor with him and hand feed him pieces of boiled chicken just to keep his weight up. Seeing a 10-pound animal that has already survived a hoarding house be reduced to a shivering pile of fur because of 2 bored kids makes something in your chest turn into lead. About a month after the police visit, a social worker from CPS showed up at my door. Her name was Brenda. She was tired-looking, carrying a leather briefcase that had seen better decades. She asked if I would be willing to provide a copy of the original, unedited footage for their formal investigation. Apparently, Sarah had told CPS that I had baited her children into the yard and that the video was deep-faked or edited to make her kids look bad. I invited Brenda in. I didn't just give her the footage from the day of the attack. I gave her everything. I showed her the footage from 3 days prior, where the younger boy was throwing lit firecrackers over the fence. I showed her the footage of Sarah standing on her back porch, glass of wine in hand, watching her kids try to poke Jasper through the mesh of his enclosure with a sharpened bamboo stake, while she did absolutely nothing. Brenda watched the screen in my living room. She didn't say much, but I saw her jaw tighten. When the clip played of the older boy hitting Jasper in the eye with a rock, she actually had to look away for a second. They told me the cat attacked them on the sidewalk, Brenda said quietly. The cameras don't lie, Brenda, I replied, and neither does the GPS timestamp on the file. She took the USB drive and left. 2 days later, a white SUV pulled up next door. It was a process server. Sarah's husband, Mark, came out to the porch in his undershirt, looking disheveled. He took the papers, read them, and I heard him scream a string of profanities that made the neighbor across the street stop mowing his lawn. They were being hit with a formal restraining order on behalf of my property, and the animal cruelty charges were being upgraded to a failure to supervise criminal citation. You'd think that would be the end of it. Normal people would pack up, move, or at least go inside and stay there. But Sarah wasn't normal. She was the kind of person who viewed accountability as a personal insult. The harassment shifted. It wasn't about the kids anymore. It was about making my life a living hell, so I'd leave. At 2 a.m., I'd hear a loud thud against my bedroom wall. I'd go out with a flashlight and find a bag of rotting household trash had been tossed over the fence. The next night, it would be a bowl of antifreeze left right against the gate of the privacy fence. They knew I had cameras, so they started using a high-powered laser pointer from their second-story window to blind the camera lenses, creating big purple splotches on the sensors. I didn't call the police this time. I called a lawyer, a mean one. His name was Miller, and he specialized in neighbor disputes and property law. He told me that in this state, intentional interference with the enjoyment of property, combined with the attempted poisoning of a pet, was enough for a civil suit that would make their mortgage look like pocket change. We don't just want them to stop, Miller told me over the phone. We want them gone. We started the filing process. But before the papers could even be served, Sarah broke. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was working from my home office when I heard a rhythmic times thwack, thwack, thwack. I looked at my monitor. Sarah was in her backyard with a sledgehammer. She wasn't hitting the fence. She was hitting the side of her own house, right near the property line, screaming my name. She looked completely unhinged. Her hair was a bird's nest, and she was wearing pajamas at 3 p.m. You ruined my family, she shrieked. My kids are in counseling. Mark lost his promotion because of the police report. You and that stupid broken cat. She dropped the sledgehammer and picked up a gallon jug. I recognized the smell through the open window before I even saw her pour it. It was gasoline. She started dousing the bottom of my new privacy fence. I didn't yell. I didn't run out. I stayed on the phone with 911 and kept the recording software running. She's pouring accelerant on the wooden fence, I told the dispatcher. She has a lighter in her hand. The police arrived in 6 minutes. They didn't come with one car. They came with 4. They caught her flicking a Zippo, trying to get the wet wood to catch. It hadn't gone up yet because she'd bought the cheap stuff and the wood was pressure treated, but the intent was there. They tackled her in the mud. Mark came running out, trying to pull the officers off her, and he got tased for his trouble. It was the most chaotic 30 minutes this street had seen in 50 years. The boys were standing in the front window, watching their parents get shoved into the back of cruisers. The fallout was absolute. Sarah was charged with attempted arson and reckless endangerment. Because of the previous CPS involvement, the boys were placed with their grandmother 3 towns over while the legal system sorted out the mess. Mark was hit with obstruction and resisting arrest. The house next door went up for sale 3 weeks later. It was a short sale. They needed to get out fast to pay for the mounting legal fees and the fines. The day they moved out, I was in the garden. I had Jasper in his harness, sitting on my lap. He was finally starting to relax again. He was watching a butterfly near the hydrangeas. Mark was loading the last of their boxes into a U-Haul. He looked 10 years older. He walked over to the fence, the one Sarah tried to burn, and looked through a gap. You happy now? He spat. You destroyed a whole family over a cat. I looked at Jasper, who was purring for the first time in months. I looked at the scar on Jasper's ear from his hoarding days and the stump where his leg used to be. I looked back at Mark. No, I said. You destroyed your family. I just recorded it. He didn't have a comeback for that. He got in the truck and drove away. The peace lasted through the fall, but the legal system moves slower than a moving truck. Just because the neighbors were gone didn't mean the paperwork disappeared. About 2 months after the librarians, Mr. and Mrs. Gable, moved in next door, I received a summons. Sarah and Mark were suing me in civil court for intentional infliction of emotional distress and defamation of character. They were claiming that my aggressive surveillance and the subsequent police reports had caused Sarah a mental breakdown, leading to her alleged arson attempt. They wanted $150,000. I called Miller. He laughed so hard I had to move the phone away from my ear. They're desperate, Miller said, his voice crackling over the speaker. They're drowning in legal fees from the criminal case, and they're looking for a life jacket. We're not just going to defend this. We're going to counter-sue for the fence damage, the private security costs, and the veterinary bills for Jasper's stress-induced weight loss. The deposition happened in a sterile, white-walled office downtown. It was the first time I'd seen Sarah since she was tackled in the mud. She looked different. She had lost weight. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, severe bun, and she wouldn't look at me. Mark sat next to her, tapping his pen on the table with a rhythmic, annoying click. Their lawyer, a guy in a suit that cost more than my car, started questioning me. He tried to paint me as a shut-in, a crazy cat person who was obsessed with the neighborhood children. Isn't it true, he asked, leaning forward, that you installed those cameras specifically to spy on 2 young boys? No, I said, keeping my voice level. I installed them because those 2 young boys were trespassing and torturing a disabled animal. The cameras were for protection. The fact that they caught your client's children committing crimes is a byproduct of their behavior, not my intent. He pushed a photo across the table. It was a shot of my privacy fence. You built this wall to isolate them, didn't you? To make them feel like criminals in their own neighborhood? I built that wall, I said, because their mother stood on my lawn with a kitchen knife and threatened to kill my cat. Wouldn't you? The lawyer shifted gears. He brought up the emotional trauma the boys had suffered being removed from the home. He tried to blame my video for the family's separation. That's when Miller stepped in. He pulled out a laptop and turned it toward Sarah's lawyer. We've obtained the discovery from the CPS file, Miller said, including the interviews with the children. Would you like to discuss the part where the 10-year-old told the social worker that his mother told him to take care of the pest next door so she wouldn't have to hear it meowing anymore? Or the part where she told them the cameras weren't real and they could do whatever they wanted? The room went dead silent. Sarah's face went from pale to a blotchy, angry red. She looked at Mark, who finally stopped clicking his pen. They hadn't realized that the boys had talked. Kids aren't great at keeping secrets, especially when they're scared and talking to a professional. The intentional infliction of emotional distress suit was dropped 48 hours later. In exchange for me not pursuing the countersuit to the full extent of the law, they signed a no-contact agreement that carried a heavy financial penalty if they ever stepped within 500 feet of me or my property again. They also had to pay for the replacement of the gasoline-soaked section of my fence. Winter came, and the suburb turned white and muffled. Jasper loved the snow. He'd sit at the glass door, watching the flakes hit the deck, his tail twitching in that slow, rhythmic way that meant he was totally at ease. One afternoon, I saw a familiar car pull up to the Gables house next door. It was Brenda, the social worker. My heart sank. For a second, I thought maybe something was wrong. But she wasn't going to the old house. She went to the Gables. A few minutes later, the 2 boys got out of the back seat. They looked different. No water guns. No rocks. They looked quiet, subdued. They were visiting the Gables, who I later found out were distant cousins of Mark's, who had stepped up to provide a stable environment while the parents were in court-mandated rehabilitation and parenting programs. I watched from the window. The boys stood on the Gables porch. The younger one looked over at my fence. He saw Jasper sitting in the window. For a second, I felt that old spike of adrenaline. I gripped the windowsill. The boy didn't reach for a rock. He didn't yell. He just raised a small hand and gave a tiny, hesitant wave toward the window. Then he turned and followed Mr. Gable inside. I didn't wave back, but I didn't pull the blinds either. Jasper blinked, his big green eyes half closing in the sunlight, reflecting off the snow. He yawned, revealing the few teeth he had left, and hopped down to find his heated bed. The Gables are good people. They keep their word. They've started a small garden of their own, and sometimes, through the fence, I hear them teaching the boys how to prune roses instead of how to hurt things. I still have the cameras. I still check them every night before I lock the doors, but the alerts on my phone are usually just for the mailman or a stray squirrel. The Karen is gone. on. Her house is occupied by people who understand that a neighborhood is built on respect, not entitlement. And Jasper, the three-legged king of the garden, finally has the kingdom he deserves. The first week of spring brought a strange sense of closure. The Gables invited me over for tea on a Sunday afternoon, and I'll admit, I was hesitant. Part of me still felt like that property line was a DMZ. But they were kind, and more importantly, they were open. They told me the boys were staying with them long-term now. The court had decided that Sarah and Mark's rehabilitation wasn't taking. Sarah had skipped 3 consecutive anger management sessions, and Mark had been picked up for a DUI. They aren't bad kids, Mr. Gable said, leaning back in his armchair. They were just raised by people who taught them that the world was a target. We're trying to show them it's a garden instead. I appreciated the sentiment, but I still kept my gate locked. A few days later, I was out back, cleaning the winter debris off the patio. Jasper was limping around the perimeter, sniffing the emerging tulips. I heard a soft rustle near the fence. I froze, my hand tightening around the handle of my rake. Mr. Peterson? A small voice whispered. It was the older boy, Leo. He was looking through one of the small gaps in the privacy fence. He didn't have his brother with him. He looked small, stripped of the bravado he'd had when he was holding that water gun. I'm not supposed to talk to you, he said, his voice shaking a little, but I wanted to say sorry about the cat and the rocks. I stood there for a long time. I thought about the video of Jasper screaming. I thought about the knife in Sarah's hand. I thought about the $5,000 I'd spent on a fence just to feel safe in my own skin. Why are you saying this now, Leo? I asked. I wasn't being mean. I genuinely wanted to know. The Gables got us a dog, he said. A little one from the shelter. He only has one eye. He's scared of everything. When I tried to pet him, he barked and hid under the bed for 2 days. I didn't get mad. I felt bad that he was scared. He paused, and I saw a tear track through the dirt on his cheek. I realized that's how your cat felt. I didn't get it before. My mom just said it was a dumb animal. I let out a breath I'd been holding for months. It takes a lot to admit that, Leo. Is he okay? The boy asked. The cat? I looked over at Jasper. He had found a patch of sun and was currently occupied with grooming his one front paw. He looked plump, shiny, and utterly unbothered. He's okay, I said. He's a survivor. Leo nodded, wiped his face, and ran back toward the Gables house. I didn't tell him we were friends. I didn't invite him over. The boundaries were there for a reason, and I wasn't ready to tear them down. But that night, the heaviness in my chest felt a little lighter. The final act of the drama came in the form of a certified letter from a law firm in a different state. Sarah and Mark had officially divorced. The house next door, which had been sitting in a sort of legal limbo, was being fully transferred to the Gables through a family trust. Sarah had moved 3 states away to live with her sister. Mark was reportedly living in a trailer on the outskirts of town, still fighting his legal battles. The Karen wasn't just gone from the neighborhood. She was gone from their lives. In June, I decided to do something I hadn't done since the day of the attack. I went to the local hardware store and bought a heavy-duty outdoor bench. I placed it right against the back fence, under the oak tree where the boys used to climb. The summer heat settled in, thick and heavy, but it didn't feel oppressive anymore. I started spending my evenings on the back deck with a cold drink, watching the sky turn from violet to a deep bruised charcoal. Jasper had reclaimed the entire yard. He had this specific routine now where he'd patrol the perimeter of the privacy fence, sniffing the baseboards, marking his territory with a rub of his chin. He walked with a confidence I hadn't seen since I first brought him home. One afternoon, I was out weeding the flower beds when I heard a familiar hum of a car engine idling in front of my house. My heart did a quick, instinctive stutter, a leftover reflex from the months of harassment. I walked around the side of the house, wiping my hands on my jeans. It wasn't Sarah's SUV. It was a beat-up sedan I didn't recognize. A man was sitting in the driver's seat, staring at my house. He looked like he'd been living out of the car. There were fast food bags piled on the passenger seat, and the dashboard was covered in dust. It took me a second to realize it was Mark. He looked terrible. He'd lost the polished, suburban dad look he used to wear like a costume. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was bloated. He rolled down the window as I approached the edge of my lawn, but I stayed a good 10 feet back, right in view of the doorbell camera. I just wanted to see the house, he said. His voice was gravelly, stripped of the arrogance it used to carry. The bank sent me the final notice on the equity. It's done. You shouldn't be here, Mark, I said. My voice was flat. The no-contact agreement is still in effect. You're within 500 feet. He let out a short, dry laugh that turned into a cough. I know. I'm not here for trouble. I'm leaving. Moving up north to work for my brother. I wanted to see where it all went wrong. He looked past me toward the Gables house. He didn't ask about his kids. He didn't ask how they were doing or if they were happy. He just looked at the bricks in the grass like he was staring at a math problem he couldn't solve. It went wrong when you decided a cat's life was worth less than your ego, I said. Mark looked at me then. For a second, I saw a flash of the old anger, the tightening of the jaw, the narrowing of the eyes, but it flickered and died. He was exhausted. He'd fought a war against a neighbor and a rescue cat, and he'd lost everything. His house, his marriage, his reputation, and his children. Give the Gables my best, he muttered. He put the car in gear and drove away without looking back. I watched the tail lights disappear around the corner. I went back to the garden and sat on the grass next to Jasper. I felt a strange sense of pity, but it was buried under a much larger sense of relief. People like Sarah and Mark think they're the main characters in everyone's story, and when the world doesn't bend to their will, they break everything around them. The Gables came over that evening for a small, end-of-summer barbecue. They brought the boys. It was the first time the kids had been on my property since the incident. Leo and his younger brother, Toby, stood by the back door, looking at their shoes. It's okay, I told them. Just stay on the patio for now. I brought Jasper out. I held him firmly, letting him see the boys from the safety of my arms. Toby reached out a hand, then pulled it back quickly, looking at Mr. Gable for permission. Can I pet him? Toby whispered. I knelt down, keeping a close eye on Jasper's ears. If they flattened, the interaction was over. Gentle. Just one finger on his head. He's very old. Toby reached out and touched the soft fur between Jasper's ears. Jasper didn't flinch. He didn't hiss. He just leaned into the touch and let out a long, slow blink. He's soft, Toby said, a huge smile breaking across his face. We spent the rest of the evening eating burgers and watching the boys play tag in the Gables yard through the open gate we decided to install between our properties. It wasn't a big gate, just a small wooden door that stayed latched unless we were hanging out. It was a bridge built on new terms. As the sun went down, the streetlights hummed to life. The neighborhood felt solid, stable. The Gables eventually gathered the boys and headed home, waving as they crossed the lawn. The months turned into a year, and the memory of Sarah and Mark began to fade like an old stain you eventually stopped noticing. The Gables officially adopted the boys in the spring. It was a small ceremony at the courthouse, and they invited me to the backyard party afterward. I brought a new collar for their one-eyed dog and a peace lily for Mrs. Gable. Seeing Leo and Toby running around without that look of hunted desperation in their eyes was the best closure I could have asked for. But the final, true end of the story didn't happen at a party. It happened happened on a random Tuesday in October. I was at my desk when a notification popped up on my computer. It was a Google alert I'd set up for Sarah and Mark's names back when the legal battle was at its peak. I'd forgotten to delete it. I clicked a link, expecting a news snippet about a court date or maybe another DUI. Instead, it was a real estate listing. Not for a house, but for a plot of land 3 counties away. Attached to it was a news article from a small town paper. Sarah had been arrested again. This time, it wasn't for a neighbor dispute. She had tried to sue a local school district over a lack of discipline after Leo and Toby were placed with the Gables, claiming the school had conspired with the state to kidnap her children. When the judge dismissed the case as frivolous, she had gone on a rampage in the clerk's office, throwing a computer monitor and biting a security guard. The article mentioned she was being held on a high bond and was undergoing a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Mark wasn't mentioned at all. It seemed he had finally vanished into the wood smoke of the north, leaving her to fight her imaginary wars alone. I closed the tab. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I just felt a profound sense of enough. I walked into the kitchen and made a cup of coffee. Jasper was sitting on the rug, batting at a stray piece of dry kibble. He was slower now. The arthritis was starting to catch up with his joints, but his spirit was still there. I picked him up, and for the first time, I carried him out to the front porch. For 2 years, the front yard had been a no-go zone. It was too exposed, too close to the street, too close to where Sarah used to scream. But today, the air was crisp and the sun was gold. I sat in the Adirondack chair and set Jasper on my lap. He stayed there, his ears swiveling as a car drove by. He didn't scramble to hide. He just watched. Mrs. Gable was out on her sidewalk, sweeping leaves. She looked up, saw us, and gave a cheerful wave. "Beautiful day for it," she called out. "The best," I shouted back. I realized then that I didn't need the cameras to tell me I was safe anymore. I knew who lived next door. I knew the rhythm of the street. I knew that if someone stepped onto my grass with a knife or a grudge, the people around me wouldn't stand on their porches and watch they'd have my back. I looked down at the beast that had supposedly ruined a family. Jasper was purring so hard my legs were vibrating. He was just a cat. A broken, resilient, 3-legged cat who had outlasted the malice of people who didn't know how to love anything. I reached into my pocket and did something I'd been planning for weeks. I opened the security app on my phone. I went into the settings, scrolled down to the delete all footage button, and pressed it. 3 years of evidence, anger, and documentation vanished in a second. Then, I hit the deactivate button on the 2 cameras facing the Gables yard. I didn't need to watch them anymore. The privacy fence stayed up. Of course, it's a good fence, and it keeps the wind off the hydrangeas, but the gate between our yards stayed unlatched. As the sun started to dip below the tree line, I felt Jasper shift. He hopped down from my lap, took 3 cautious steps toward the edge of the porch, and laid down in a patch of light. He stretched his single front leg out as far as it would go, closed his eyes, and fell into a deep, fearless sleep right in the open air. The winter after Sarah's final arrest was the quietest one yet. The snow fell in thick, heavy blankets that muffled the world, turning the neighborhood into a landscape of white mounds and gray shadows. I spent most of those months inside with the fireplace going, reading through a stack of books I'd put off for years. Jasper spent his time sprawled on a heated sheepskin rug right in front of the hearth, looking more like a decorative pillow than a vicious beast. One evening, right around Christmas, there was a knock at the door. I looked at the monitor force of habit and saw Leo and Toby standing there, bundled up in heavy parkas and bright red scarves. They were holding a tin covered in festive foil. I opened the door, and the cold air rushed in, smelling of wood smoke and pine. "Grandma made these," Toby said, holding the tin out with both hands. "They're peppermint bark. She said to tell you thanks for the snowblower help. I'd spent an hour clearing the Gables driveway the day before after Mr. Gable's back had started acting up. Tell her thank you, Toby. That's very kind." The boys lingered for a second, their breath frosting in the air. Leo, the older one, looked past me into the warm living room. "Is Jasper in there?" he asked quietly. "He's by the fire," I said. "You guys want to come in for a minute to warm up?" They hesitated, then stepped onto the rug, shaking the snow off their boots. They moved with a carefulness that broke my heart a little, like they were still afraid of being too loud, of taking up too much space. They walked over to the fireplace and looked down at Jasper. The cat didn't even open both eyes. He just let out a sleepy, trilling sound and stretched his stump of a leg. Toby reached down, checked with me first, and then lightly scratched the base of Jasper's ears. "He's happy now," Toby whispered. "He is," I said. As they left, Leo stopped at the door. He looked at the security monitor on the wall, the one showing the 4 feeds of the property. He stared at it for a long time. "I'm glad you had those," he said. "It wasn't an apology this time. It was an observation. I used to think you were mean for watching us, but I think if you hadn't been watching, we'd still be over there, with her." He didn't wait for an answer. He just pulled his hat down and ran after his brother into the snow. That was the moment I realized the victory wasn't just about the cat. It wasn't even about the property line. It was about the fact that the truth has a way of rearranging the world until things are where they belong. Sarah and Mark were gone because they couldn't exist in a world where the truth was recorded and played back. They needed the shadows. They needed people to be too afraid or too polite to say what was actually happening. As the years passed, the fence stayed. The camera stayed, though I rarely looked at the footage unless a package went missing. Jasper lived to be 19. He passed away on a warm Tuesday in July, tucked into his favorite sun patch on the deck, surrounded by the scent of the catnip the Gables had planted for him years ago. I buried him in the corner of the garden, under the oak tree. The Gables and the boys came over. Leo, who was now a teenager and nearly as tall as I was, helped me dig the hole. We didn't say much. We didn't have to. When the last of the dirt was settled, Toby placed a smooth river stone on top. He'd painted a small green heart on it. The garden grew wilder as I got older. I didn't mind. The Gables eventually moved to a smaller condo closer to the city when the boys went off to college, and a young couple with a newborn moved in. They were terrified of the 8-foot privacy fence at first, thinking I was some kind of hermit, until I walked over with a basket of tomatoes and told them the history of the wood. I told them about the gasoline. I told them about the rocks. I told them about a 3-legged cat named Jasper who taught a whole neighborhood how to stand up for what's right. They listened with wide eyes, looking at their own peaceful backyard, as if they were standing on a former battlefield. In a way, they were. "The fence stays. The new husband, a guy named David, said after I finished the story. I think I'd like to keep that piece going." 10 years after Jasper passed, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just a postmark from a city 3 states over. Inside was a single photograph and a short, handwritten note. The photo was of a young man in a graduation gown. He was holding a diploma and grinning, looking healthy and strong. It was Leo. Beside him was a woman I didn't recognize. At first, she was older, gray-haired, but she had that familiar Gable smile. The note read, "I'm a veterinarian now. I specialize in rescues and difficult cases. I thought you should know that I still think about the cat under the lawn chair. I make sure none of them ever feel like that again. Thank you for not backing down." I put the photo on my mantel, right next to the small ceramic urn that held Jasper's ashes. One evening, I was sitting on my porch when a car I didn't recognize pulled up to the curb. It was a sleek, modern electric thing. A woman stepped out. She was older, her face etched with deep lines of bitterness that even time couldn't soften. She stood on the sidewalk, staring at my house. It was Sarah. She looked at the fence. She looked at the cameras, which were long since disconnected but still perched like gargoyles on the corners of the roof. She looked at me, sitting there in my chair. I didn't move. I didn't wave. I didn't feel the old spike of fear or the heat of anger. I just watched her. She opened her mouth as if she were going to yell, as if she had one last, "I'm going to kill your cat," or "You ruined my life," left in her lungs. But then she looked at the house next door. She saw the colorful plastic toys scattered on the lawn of her old home. She saw the life that had continued without her, better and brighter than it ever was when she lived there. She looked back at me, realized I was recording nothing but still seeing everything, and her shoulders slumped. She looked small, just a lonely, angry woman who had burned her own world down and was now wandering through the ashes. She got back in her car and drove away. She didn't even leave a tire mark. I stood up, my bones creaking, and walked down the steps into the garden. I made my way to the corner, to the stone with the painted green heart. The paint was chipping now, the green fading into the gray of the rock, but you could still see the shape. "We did it, Jasper," I whispered. I didn't expect much after Sarah's brief, ghostly appearance on the sidewalk. When you've lived through a war like that, you expect a final explosion, but life usually just sputters out into a long, quiet hum. A few weeks after she showed up, David, the new neighbor, came over. He was carrying a hammer and a box of heavy-duty deck screws. He looked a bit sheepish, scratching the back of his neck as he pointed at the privacy fence. "Hey, I noticed a couple of the boards near the bottom are starting to rot out," he said. "The ones near that old oak tree. I was going to replace them, but I remembered what you said about the gasoline. I didn't want to mess with the history if you weren't ready." I walked down to the corner of the lot with him. He was right. The wood was graying, the grain opening up to let the dampness in. It had stood for decades, a silent wooden shield, but even the best fences eventually succumb to the earth. "Fix them, David," I said. "The fence did its job. It doesn't need to be a monument to a bad time anymore." I sat on my bench and watched him work. He was careful, pulling the old, scarred boards away. As he pried one loose near the base of the oak, something caught the light in the dirt. David reached down and pulled out a rusted, dirt-caked object. He wiped it on his work pants and handed it to me. It was a small plastic rake. The tines were snapped, and the handle was bent. I held it in my palm, feeling the weight of 30 years. This was the thing those boys had used to poke at Jasper when he was trapped under the lawn chair. It had been buried under the leaves and the silt, a piece of evidence I'd missed, a relic of the exact moment my life turned into a battleground. "You want me to toss it?" David asked. I looked at the rake, then looked over at the stone with the green heart. I thought about Leo, the veterinarian. I thought about Toby and his peppermint bark. I thought about the man Mark had become a ghost in a sedan, and the shell of a woman Sarah had turned into. "Yeah," I said, handing it back. "Toss it. It's just trash now." David finished the repairs by sunset. The new boards were bright, clean cedar, smelling of fresh sap and possibilities. They stood out against the weathered gray of the rest of the fence, a patch of new skin on an old wound. That night, I had a dream. It wasn't one of the bad ones where I'm running home from the grocery store with my blood turning to ice. I was just standing in the garden. The fence was gone. Not because it had been torn down, but because it wasn't needed. There were no cameras. There were no locks. Jasper was there, but he had all four legs. He was jumping for a dragonfly, his body stretching out long and lithe in the air, landing perfectly on the grass without a limp. I woke up at dawn. The house was cold, and my joints ached with the kind of deep, internal cold that only comes when you've crossed 80. I made a pot of tea and sat by the window. I realized I wasn't afraid of the silence anymore. For years, I'd filled the quiet with the hum of monitors and the clicking of locks. I'd treated peace like something that had to be guarded with a sword. But as I watched the sun hit those new cedar boards, I understood that peace isn't the absence of a fight. It's what grows after the fight is won, and the soil is finally clear. I spent the afternoon packing up the last of the physical evidence. I took the old hard drives from the original camera system, the ones I'd kept in a fireproof safe, just in case the law ever came knocking again, and I put them in a box. I drove down to the local electronic recycling center and watched them drop the drives into the shredder. I watched the metal teeth chew through the footage of the rocks, the water guns, and the screaming. I watched the bits of plastic and silicon fall into the bin. It felt like breathing for the first time in 30 years. When I got home, the neighborhood was alive with the sounds of a Saturday. David was teaching his kid how to ride a tricycle on the sidewalk. Someone a few houses down was grilling burgers, the smell drifting over the fences. I walked into my backyard and sat under the oak tree. I didn't look at the house next door with suspicion. I didn't scan the fence for gaps. I just closed my eyes and listened to the wind. I knew I didn't have many summers left. My heart was tired, and the world was moving faster than I could keep up with. But as I sat there, I felt a familiar, phantom weight against my ankle. It was just the tall grass brushing against my skin in the breeze. But for a second, it felt exactly like a cat rubbing his chin against my leg, marking me as his own. I smiled. I wasn't a crazy cat person or a hermit or a victim. I was just a man in a garden, and the garden was quiet. I stayed there until the stars came out, a lone figure in the dark, perfectly content, perfectly safe, and finally, completely alone with my thoughts. The war was over, the record was clear, and the truth had finally set everyone free.